pretty much about 50% right
30
from
to 50.
30 to 50.
Unless it's like the president. or
Right,
something.
of course, right.
But, yeah, no, that's 30 to 50%.
Okay. So you do have an idea of how many people are going to show and how it is. Great.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to start the second panel because I don't want to run out of time on the other end. And we have some really interesting speakers. The idea of this session again today, as I said at the outset, was to focus first on the country studies that we commissioned and enter into some of the details of what they found. I think Steve Dudley hit it on the head when he said we got into the weeds a little bit in our reports on the countries, but I think it was very valuable and a useful exercise. But now we're in the second stage here, and we want to talk about policy, where U.S. policy is headed, what are some of the new things the U.S. is going to try to do, and we have invited some top-line speakers to help us discuss this this morning. First of all, we'll hear from Deputy Assistant Secretary Francisco Palmieri. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Caribbean and Central America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. He has an extensive experience in the State Department and in the Foreign Service, and I think he's ideal for a variety of reasons. One, because he's where he is now, which is important, related to the Central America, but he also has extensive experience, and when I first got to know him, working for INL, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And so, you know, as we discussed this morning, there's a big role for INL in all this, and obviously there's a big role for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, so I think he kind of can give us a broader view and understanding, even though you're not here to talk for INL, I want to be clear, but I think you understand the broader picture. So that's one. Secondly, Paloma Adams-Allen is the Senior Advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development for Latin America and the Caribbean Bureau. She was appointed to that position on November 20th, 2010, so she's been there now 4 years. I must confess, we worked together at the Organization of American States in the Office of the Secretary General. I was a lowly program officer on the 4th floor, and she was a senior advisor to the Secretary General. But nevertheless, we did work together, and her knowledge of the Caribbean and Central America are second to none to anybody in the room who is not Central American, I should highlight, right? So thank you, Paloma, for being here and providing us some insight into USAID and what it's doing in Central America. Thirdly, another friend and a colleague that I've worked with a great deal over the years, Matthew Ingram, is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at and a research associate at the Center for Social and Demographic Analysis, the University of Albany, State University of New York. Matt participated in this research project as well, and you'll see he has a chapter that he co-wrote with Carice Curtis. And I decided to have him participate in this panel because his research is really one very innovative, looking at detail at homicides, and he does a very interesting geographic spatial analysis of those homicides and also a number of policy focused recommendations related to that analysis. So I thought it would be complementary to hear from a member of our research team talking about how policy may be shifted or some new ways of thinking about policy in Central America and in the context of CARSI. Just for the benefit of Paco and Paloma, who weren't here this morning, I just thought I would throw out a few things that came up. I'm not asking you to respond to them necessarily, but just so you have a little bit of context. A couple of the issues that came up, I think, again, was the sense that CARSI has done some good things, but tends to be kind of, my words, a multi-headed monster. Or Steve Dudley maybe said it more charitably, an amoeba that self-divides. And so there are a lot of good things going on, but we're not sure that it adds up to success. We're not sure that when you put all these different initiatives together, that it adds up to success. And a second thing that emerged, which I've struggled with too, is the sense that U.S. has been doing a lot of this work for a long time in Central America. We've been doing justice reform since, I believe, 1987 in Honduras. Pretty hard-pressed to say that in that period of time things are markedly better in the justice sector in Honduras. It's not for lack of resources or good intentions. We're doing a lot of things, but we're just not seeing it amount to a change. And I think this is troubling for all of us who want to see things improve in Central America. And I know it's troubling for you all and things that you wrestle on too, wrestle with too. And the third thing is this sense of, we do a lot of stuff, we do a lot of programs, a lot of them are good, well-intentioned and so on, but we don't do a very good job of evaluation of those programs. And not just the evaluation of how much money we spent or how many people we trained, but really what is the impact of that. And we did highlight, out of fairness, that USAID has begun to do a good job on that, but there's a lot more to be done, right? A lot more to happen. Somebody suggested that we weren't clear in our own recommendations on impact evaluation. For me, an impact evaluation is you start with a bottom line before you do anything. You measure every year and then look at it at the end and see, have you had any impact? And that's the key, and I think that's what Vanderbilt University did in part for USAID's programs. And the last thing I'll throw out is the sense that, again, a lot of good intentions, a lot of money, a lot of things happening, but sometimes the governments themselves that we're trying to assist and encourage and build up aren't necessarily committed to the same things, are willing to accept money, are willing to train people, but the tough things of rooting out corruption, the tough things of putting people in jail, the tough things that go beyond simply writing a new law, but actually implementing that law, get left behind. And so these are the troubling aspects. These are the things that we highlight in the report, a lot more. We have some recommendations, but I throw them out there just so that you know a little bit of the context of the first panel's discussion, and we can talk through these along the way. I know you have some prepared remarks, so I'm not expecting you to respond to each one of those points now, but I hope it will be part of our conversation. So I turn it over to you, Paco. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Eric, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you and the audience this morning about U.S. engagement with Central America. I'm also very grateful for the research the Wilson Center has conducted on U.S. assistance in Central America. I think these findings are going to be very helpful in informing the way ahead for us, and there are lots of really good recommendations and ideas on how we can improve, and we certainly need to improve moving forward. So we can learn a good deal from your research and the expertise and from the discussions today. The summaries and evaluations of the CARSI projects that we've been working in the region are really well researched and well detailed. The projects themselves were proofs of concept. They were pilot in nature and intentionally limited to small geographic areas or limited population groups, offering more for our regional partners models of success to emulate. And while we believe CARSI has shown some success, it really was never funded at a level to have a systematic impact by itself. It is clear, however, that there is now a need for our efforts with partners to have a more systemic impact, and the seminar today is timely. I would argue that we are at the most important juncture with Central America-U.S. relations in the last 20 years. Central America presents challenges for the United States and for other regional actors, but also offers us significant opportunities. Central America matters to us because of geographic proximity, our family and cultural ties, the recognition that we, the United States, bear responsibility for some of the region's conditions, and the fact that grave challenges know no borders. Today, some Central American countries face complex situations that simply outstrip their capacity to respond. This year, more than 60,000 unaccompanied children left their homes in Central America to make a dangerous, perilous journey to the United States. From a foreign policy perspective, the spike in migration is a serious warning sign that the long-standing challenges in Central America are worsening. The course of action is clear. We must adequately address the underlying factors compelling migration, or be prepared for what is likely to be an ongoing cyclical phenomenon with significant costs to the United States. Fortunately, we believe the essential condition for finding solutions is present: political will in the region. The Inter-American Development Bank recently hosted a conference on Central America where Vice President Biden and the presidents of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras spoke about opportunities and challenges for growth in Central America. At the conference, the presidents publicly presented an historic, coordinated plan, the Alliance for Prosperity. Their plan seeks to address the challenges facing the three Northern Triangle countries and includes a clear-eyed assessment of the tasks, well-considered lines of actions to resolve them, and specific steps that they themselves, the countries, will take. The president's message at the conference was simple: the region's leaders will make tough choices to address challenges, but they need our help. Not just the help of the United States, but of the entire international community. And so over the past 18 months, long before the mass media picked up the messages of children arriving at the border, the U.S. government has been taking a hard look at both our approach and our investments. While security is paramount, we have broadened our vision for how we achieve it. We developed an interagency strategy, the U.S. strategy for engagement with Central America, and we are pleased to see that the Northern Triangle's own Alliance for Prosperity plan contains many of the objectives that we consider essential in moving the region forward. A secure, democratic, and prosperous Central America will provide an environment in which all of its citizens choose to remain and thrive. We agree that strategy matters. The migration challenges of this past summer required an immediate, urgent response to the humanitarian situation. But we know that there are underlying factors behind the outbound migration that require a more strategic and sustained effort. In our judgment, the most relevant vision for the region is an economically integrated Central America, a single market that provides economic opportunities to its people, democratic, accountable, transparent, and effective public institutions, and a safe environment for its citizens to build their lives in peace and stability. We are all familiar with Central America's security challenges, but the economic and governance indicators are equally alarming. Over half the population in Guatemala and Honduras live below the poverty line. Less than 4% of young people enroll in secondary school in El Salvador. In Honduras, less than 11% of women aged 25 to 65 have access to formal employment, and the workforce has an average of only 6 years of schooling. Central America also has among the world's lowest tax revenue as a percentage of gross domestic product, with Guatemala coming in lowest at 10.8% of GDP. Business owners are hampered by high energy and water costs. Transparency International consistently ranks many Central American nations poorly on its index for perception of corruption. And in this context, Central America's tremendous youth bulge threatens even greater turmoil. 6 million people will attempt to enter the Central American workforce over the next decade who cannot be absorbed. Disenfranchised youth will very likely either form the foundation of gangs or other groups engaged in illicit activities, or migrate, seeking economic opportunity or fleeing violence. Our strategy requires great clarity about the domestic and regional and international assumptions we make in producing it. First, from a U.S. standpoint, we believe that significant U.S. interagency assistance over the next 5 years and sustained policy level attention to Central America are critical to achieving our objectives. We simply will not achieve the end state we envision with current resources or with a short-term surge of assistance. Changing the trajectory of Central America will require a sustained and well-resourced engagement from the United States and other partners, and is directly in the national interest of the United States. U.S. efforts will be multiplied and better sustained if we partner with governments and other Central American stakeholders. Our strategy includes 3 objectives, co-equal, each reinforcing the others: prosperity, governance, security. This builds on some of our existing work, but also represents a broader and more balanced engagement with Central America than we have seen in recent years. For prosperity, Central America must integrate economically in order to compete globally. Integrating a regional market of 43 million people will reap economies of scale for local businesses and offer attractive opportunities for investors. But economic growth should reach everyone, not just the already well-connected few. We should aim to create an environment that brings women, youth, and marginalized populations into the formal economy. The governance objective is ultimately about transparency and anti-corruption. It's about breaking a cycle. The relationship between democratic, transparent political institutions and economic growth is convincing. Economic growth is only sustainable in an environment where democratic values and institutions flourish, impunity is reduced, and civil society and the media can play their rightful roles. An engaged and informed civil society is an important accountability mechanism and government motivator. For these reasons, U.S. efforts will promote government accountability, institutional checks and balances, judicial reforms, human rights protections, and again, increased civil society participation in the democratic process. The security agenda will undoubtedly remain a core priority. We must collectively and effectively address insecurity now. We will address the security sector at many levels: the community, the police, the court systems, and the prisons. And we must amplify and target our interventions at the community level. We will bring successful community-based interventions to scale, targeting the geographic areas of need so that they can truly have a transformative impact. We will seek to work with partner governments to devise police reform strategies and then focus our efforts on supporting those strategies. Next steps. Despite serious and complex challenges, there is reason to be optimistic about Central America's future. The 3 leaders of the Northern Triangle have already begun to make tough decisions and are investing their own national budgets. I think Paloma will mention this. Panama and Costa Rica are demonstrating the economic benefits of modernization and integration, and now is the time for a new U.S. approach to Central America that prioritizes and balances investments in prosperity, governance, and security. We have a vision, we have a plan, and we are committed to working with Central American governments and other partners to change the region's trajectory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paco. Now let's turn to Paloma.
Thank you, Paco. Actually, Paco has covered much of what I intended to talk about, but I want to get a little bit more into USAID's piece of the approach to Central America, crime and violence in Central America, and specifically to address a bit the impact evaluation that we had conducted by Vanderbilt University, which tested, as Paco mentioned, in a small number of communities, treatment communities versus control communities, whether various crime and violence prevention interventions work. And the findings of that study say, yes, they work. People feel safer. They have more confidence in the police, among a slew of other findings. Now that we know that primary level, community level interventions work, we're now trying to figure out what do we do next. And as Paco mentioned, we're focused on scaling up, i.e. moving beyond just the community level prevention programs that provide services to at-risk youth, help with community policing, provide safe spaces for young people, and into more targeted support to young people who are at risk of moving into lives of crime, and specifically also to young people who may have been in conflict with the law already and who are now looking for avenues to get out of that those lives. And we're specifically calling our new approach, and I have my colleagues here who can correct me if I'm wrong, a place-based, people-focused approach, i.e. we currently work in hotspot communities, as we call them, where there are high levels of crime and violence across the Northern Triangle of Central America. But we do that typically sometimes alongside our INL colleagues, law enforcement, sometimes not. We haven't been very purposeful and strategic about how we're going to do that. We've decided that, yes, prevention works, but in order to really have transformational impact, we need to do that alongside our law enforcement colleagues in the same communities, with us focused on young people and their needs, and with INL focused on the bad guys. And in that way, we believe we can have greater impact than just this prevention approach. In addition, we need to scale out. That is, we've been working in a select and small group of communities, testing over 5 years whether prevention works, how it works, are things improving. Now that we know community-level prevention works, we now need to expand our geographic footprint, and that we intend to do alongside our INL colleagues. You mentioned, Eric, a little bit about, whether there's political will and the need for political will. In our experience, we've all, at least in the U.S. government, been trying different approaches, and we've had different experiences with national level and municipal level authorities. In our experience, both at the national and municipal level, there's been really great receptivity and generally an embrace of prevention. Folks want to do good things for young people. They want to improve communities. We've seen that. For example, through our work with them, many governments have issued national prevention policies. At the municipal level, they've developed and are implementing municipal level crime prevention plans. We see that as serious commitment. As Paco mentioned, in the wake of the unaccompanied minors sort of coming in droves over the summer, the Central American governments have stepped up, and they've declared to us, to our highest levels of our leadership, that they intend to address this issue, and we believe them. They've presented their plan, and we believe that's a serious political will. Not only are governments doing that, but other key stakeholders in Central American society, the private sector, the likes of Walmart, Tigo, Microsoft, you name it, they have been working very closely with us and have committed to us that they are ready to do more. And so we feel very positive that while none of us are doing as much as we can, we have partners to move ahead on this. And so I'd be happy to address everything else through questions, Eric.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And Matt, I think Matt has some PowerPoint slides, so give him a second here to get set up.
You see over my big head.
Do I just forward?
Yeah. Oh. No, so hold on a second. That's my fault. Sleep at the switch here. Okay. Is that it?
Yes.
Slideshow. I'm beginning. Okay.
Well, first, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Wilson Center, for having me and join not just the project, but also the event here today. I'm going to try to address two questions with my presentation. I have several maps. That's why I have some slides here for you. All of the images are in the report in the book. But the two main questions I'm trying to address are how to better target violence prevention, violence reduction policies. So it's a question of policy targeting. And then what might the content of those policies look like? What are some lessons that we might draw about the content of these violence reduction, violence prevention policies? Hopefully what I'm going to say, since I'm coming at the end of the day, resonates with what some of the previous speakers have said already. I've already identified several places where what I have found resonates with what the prior speaker said, so I'll try to draw those out during the course of my presentation. I'm also going to tell you what I'm going to tell you in case you need to leave early. Then I'm going to tell you, and then I'll tell you again what I told you. And hopefully some of that sticks. So you'll see this slide again towards the end along with the next slide. But basically, speaking to what Cristina was talking about, and I also believe what Paloma was referring to with the place-based logic of programming, I try to emphasize that a lower level of analysis will often reveal insights, patterns that would otherwise be obscured at a national level of analysis. Violence, I'm looking at homicide rates, so I'm only talking about homicide, but I might speak more generally about violence. Clusters geographically in distinct, non-random ways, and these clusters also help target policies. And the analysis that I've done goes increasingly narrower or at a lower level of analysis from Central America as a region to the Northern Triangle countries to the municipal level within El Salvador. And hopefully Cristina will have lots of observations to offer about that part of the findings. But basically, at the lowest level of the second stage of the analysis in El Salvador offers the lowest level of analysis. Different types of homicides, so I look at aggregate homicides, homicides of women, femicides, and then youth homicides differently, and these different types of homicide cluster differently, again informing policy targeting. And education in a more thorough explanatory analysis has a protective effect, that is, as education increases, violence drops. So this informs what the content of policies might look like. And then I'm happy to answer questions about the methods regarding this, but basically violence in nearby places increases the risk of violence in your home focal community. So policies need to be targeted at sets or groups of communities. This is what I usually call a sort of regional logic of policy targeting. We can't target policies at isolated communities. That might resonate with with Paloma and what other people have been talking about with regards to targeting maybe places or individual localities. I would argue you need to target sort of relevantly connected sets of localities and municipalities to have more of a regional effect. And one of the sort of non-findings that I find very curious and interesting and provocative is that security capacity in El Salvador, captured as expenditures and the number of police personnel, does not have a statistically significant relationship with violence. So this raises all kinds of questions about increasing security capacity, police capacity, as opposed to investing, as many other people have emphasized already before me, in prevention, right? Real prevention, deep-rooted social, economic programs to prevent violence, to prevent people from joining violent groups in the first place, right? Sort of addressing the root causes of crime rather than reacting to crime after it's already taking place. Several policy implications. You'll see this slide again towards the end. I speak about geographic targeting of violence reduction policies. We should target policies at urban areas or areas with higher population, at regions or sets of communities, as I've said already. And the particular geographic targeting might very well vary according to the type of violence that we're trying to address. So we need to pay attention to that kind of variation. We should also pay special attention to clusters or sets of communities that straddle existing jurisdictional boundaries, and I'll come back to this during the course of some of the slides. Speaking particularly about the Northern Triangle, there are several clusters of violence that straddle the Guatemalan and Salvadoran border, the Guatemalan-Honduran border, the Honduran and Salvadoran border. These kinds of clusters that straddle jurisdictional boundaries raise very difficult questions about coordination, another topic that has come up repeatedly during the prior presentations. So I'll return to that. And then I'll finish again emphasizing the main priority that I would emphasize in terms of the content of violence prevention, violence reduction policies is promoting education. I suppose that speaks to Peter's original question, right? If we were to pick one thing to invest the extra $100 million in, I would say education. So here's a very quick map of where I'm heading over the next 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to go through some maps very quickly. The outcome of interest, or the core measure that I'm looking at, is homicide rates, number of homicides per 100,000 people. This is a standard rate. Several people have thrown out a couple of numbers recently. The level of analysis is subnational, sometimes departmental, sometimes municipal. Again, looking at these homicide rates below the national level, right? Below the level of analysis that we're usually accustomed to seeing. And I'm looking at these two questions, right? How to target violence and what might be the content of those violence. And again, just to emphasize, I'll be going increasingly narrower, zooming in progressively from the entire region to the Northern Triangle to El Salvador at the municipal level. This is a trend, longitudinal temporal trend of homicide rates in Central America as a region. You can see a solid black line is Central America. The dotted line is Latin America, all countries in Latin America as a region. One of the features that sets Latin America apart over the last 6-7 years is an incredibly high level of violence in terms of homicide rates compared to other regions of the world globally. And also the trend is increasing, at least through 2012. I don't have data for the last 2 years, but at least through 2012, where other countries, other regions of the world were showing a low and dropping rate of homicide, Latin America as a region sees a very high and increasing rate of homicide. These are all the Central American countries. Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador are the two top lines, stand out from all the rest. Guatemala is the next one down, green. For the last 10 years approximately, Honduras and El Salvador have reported the two highest homicide rates in the world, right? 10 years running. This is another way of visualizing this data. If we look at the national homicide rates, you can see sort of darker colors identify higher homicide rates. This is what it looks like at the first subnational administrative level, right? This is where I would emphasize you can start to see things that you wouldn't see at a national level, right? This is where you would expect to start to see, if we could drill down to the municipal level throughout the entire Central American region, you might see the municipality of Desamparados that Christina was talking about earlier on the suburbs of San Jose. If we look just at the Northern Triangle, again, darker colors identify those departments that are most violent. You can see whether it's in the entire region or just the Northern Triangle, that even in those countries that we're used to thinking of as very violent, there are areas that are not violent. And if we look at the entire region down at Panama, for instance, normally people would say, well, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, less violent than the Northern Triangle, but we see some of the examples of what Christina was talking about earlier, right? There are other places, if we drill down below the national level, where we can see similarly high levels of violence. If we look just in El Salvador, these are El Salvador's departments, all homicides for 2013. This is the municipal level for 2013, and I keep going back to Christina because she said a lot of things that resonated with my findings. She identified 14 municipalities where there have been no homicides for the last 6 years or so. Here you can see in a single snapshot for 2013, there are multiple municipalities with 0 homicides. By the same token, you can see several municipalities with homicide rates over 100. This is astronomical, right? The homicide rate in the United States, just for a point of reference for those that aren't familiar, has been hovering around 5, right, for multiple years. Our worst cities, New Orleans, Flint, Michigan recently, Baltimore, have homicide rates around 50. There's only a handful of cities in the United States that have homicide rates around 50 or anything above 45. This is over 100. This is femicides, homicides of women. Again, you can see some of the patterns that Christina was talking about, right? Multiple municipalities that have 0 homicides of women in 2013, and several municipalities that have femicide rates above 50. These are data for youth. Again, similar patterns, right? Multiple municipalities with 0 incidents of youth homicides, multiple municipalities with very high levels of youth homicides. Again, several of them above 50. So are these patterns statistically significant, right? Is what we're seeing in these maps anything that we would expect to find other than by chance, right? Other than at random. So looking at the entire region, these are what I believe Paloma talked about hotspots, and other people have talked about hotspot analyses. These are statistically significant clusters of violence, what other people might refer to as hotspots or cold spots. Basically, each department that is colored in red has a higher than average homicide rate for the entire region, and is surrounded by other departments that also have higher than average homicide rates for the region. And if we were to, I'm forgetting the word for, what happens when you're dealing cards or playing cards and you resort the shuffle. If we shuffle all of these departments around multiple times, and we can get at some estimates of the statistical significance of these associations. So basically, where all of the departments that are not colored in, that are blank, have no statistical relationship with their neighboring municipalities. But the departments that are colored in have a statistically significant relationship with their neighboring municipalities. And due to their color, we can tell whether those are high levels, sort of departments where we have hot spots, where the level of violence is high and they're surrounded by a neighborhood of high level of violence, or the department is a cold spot, right? It's a department where there's a low level of violence and they're surrounded by a neighborhood of low levels of violence. Again, returning to Christina's points, right? Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and at least the northern part of Panama is an entire region straddling 3 countries, essentially, that's a cold spot, right? In contrast, there's a part of the northern part of Honduras, the northern part of El Salvador, and the southern part of Guatemala that is a more distinct hotspot, right? Not the entire countries, not the entire territory of all 3 countries in the Northern Triangle, but this, we can actually start to sort of bound or identify the boundaries of the places where we would like to target our policies. Again, returning to one of the core questions that I'm trying to address, right? This kind of cluster analysis can help us inform targeting of our violence prevention, violence reduction policies. This is the Northern Triangle. The patterns shift a little bit because you've taken out all of the lower countries of Central America, right? And you've taken out Belize. But you can do multiple types of these analyses, and you come up to a relatively consistent hotspot. If you're only concerned about the Northern Triangle countries, then you should be concerned about the northern part of Honduras spreading into the southeastern part of Guatemala, right? It's probably the area of greatest concern. If we're looking only at El Salvador, again, drilling down, zooming in to the municipal level in El Salvador, this is homicides, all homicides. These are your hot spots and cold spots, right? We see a kind of inverted horseshoe around the nation's capital, and then a stretch along the coastline that deserves our attention, right? This is probably where we should target our resources if we're concerned about all homicides. If we're concerned only about femicides, you've seen this map before, this is what the femicide clusters look like. Right? Again, if we want to target our resources at combating homicides against women, we want to focus on these red spots. We might want to learn something about those blue spots. And youth homicides, there's a dramatic, sizable cluster around the nation's capital. Right? If we're concerned about youth homicides in El Salvador, we should be investing resources not just in the capital city, right? Not just in San Salvador, but in all of these municipalities that make a larger sort of metropolitan area region around San Salvador. In terms of the more explanatory analysis aiming to identify some of the content of violence prevention policies, this was a fuller, more complete analysis that I only did in El Salvador. Education consistently has a statistically significant and negative, that is protective effect on homicide rates. Right? As educational attainment increases, homicide rates drop. Population size increases violence, so this is large urban areas or the more populated areas have a higher risk of homicide. An unusual, unexpected finding is that extreme poverty has a negative relationship with homicide. This is not what I would expect, right? Normally you think that where resources are absent, this tends to promote violence or lead people into a life of crime. The results don't support that, at least in El Salvador. And then what I mentioned earlier, this kind of provocative finding, given all of our investment in security infrastructure and policing in particular, that where the numbers of police are higher and where the expenditures for police are higher, does not seem to have a statistically significant relationship with homicides, at least in this one snapshot, right? 2013, all homicides. The other really provocative finding that I would highlight for you is that violence in nearby areas, if we look at the violence in nearby communities, as violence in nearby communities increases, violence in your home, focal community increases. This is a marked, consistent, robust, statistically significant relationship. This again encourages us to think of violence prevention, violence reduction regionally. Right? We don't want to target resources or policies at isolated communities. We want to identify relevantly connected sets, groups, clusters of communities, and target our resources or our policies regionally to those sets of communities. I can come back to that. So I'll just finish here with these, returning to these policy implications. Eric has just told me I have 2 minutes, so we can spend 120 seconds looking at these policy implications. You've already seen this slide, right? I told you what I was going to tell you. I told you, and now I'm going to tell you what I told you again. Just trying to emphasize some of the policy implications of this research. Policies, in terms of targeting our violence prevention, violence reduction policies, we need to take geography into consideration, right? I'm encouraged by the words of Paloma of this place-based motivation for programming, but I would really encourage to think more systematically about what that means. Are we thinking about isolated communities, or are we thinking about regions of communities, neighborhoods of communities, communities that are next to each other, right? If we want to really emphasize where to target most of our resources, we should aim at highly populated communities, urban communities, but then also look at the communities around those highly populated communities, right? As we saw with the example, the dramatic example of youth violence around the capital of El Salvador. We need to pay attention to those sets or regions or clusters of communities that straddle existing jurisdictional boundaries. This straddling phenomenon poses really serious challenges to policy coordination, especially where there might be political tensions or rivalries across those jurisdictional boundaries, be they departmental in some countries or national. Right? In other research in federal countries, this can be a really serious hurdle if you're thinking about coordinating policies across states, say in Mexico, Brazil, United States. And then the one big thing that I would prioritize in terms of the content of our violence reduction, violence prevention policies, having already talked about the targeting of those policies, is education. We need to do more to promote education as a violence prevention, violence reduction policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Very interesting research, and I really do recommend all the chapters, but Matt really does take a unique look at the phenomenon. I want to just make two observations. One, it's subtle, but it's interesting to me that the word drug trafficking and narcotics really didn't come up much in any of the presentations. And when we look back at the origins of CARSI and the debate and the discussion and sometimes the official statements, it's interesting because oftentimes violence and homicide and drug trafficking are sort of assumed to be interchangeable, that we're sort of talking about the same thing, and that the problems in Central America are ones of drug trafficking fundamentally. And if you want to address homicides and problems in Central America, you have to deal with the drug trafficking issue. And I just observed that we really didn't touch on that much here. I think, frankly, that's useful because I think too much of U.S. policy over the years has been driven by a counter-narcotics focus. I'm not suggesting counter-narcotics aren't a problem, that they're not coming through Central America. Obviously they are. They contribute to the homicide. But that's a segment of the overall problem. The problem goes way, way beyond what happens in terms of drug trafficking. And that's why I think our conclusion that CARSI really needs to rethink the strategy, to be clear about what its priority. Is the priority reducing homicides, reducing violence, or fighting drugs? And you can't just say, oh, well, they're all the same. There is a difference. There are femicides. There are other kinds of violence and other kinds of homicides that need to be dealt with uniquely in that regard. The second thing is that this issue that we've heard repeatedly is focus. We need to be focused, and that's another element of the lack of a strategy. When you don't have a strategy, you have a series of priorities, then things all become sort of relatively equal, and it doesn't amount to anything. And I think that's the other element here. Focus, clarity about priorities really has to be at the top of the agenda. And how you answer the question of what the priority is, what the focus is, should inform the policy. Too many times policy is sort of a grab bag of 100 things, and we know there are 100 challenges that Central America faces. But what are the priority ones? What are the ones we're going to put front and center? From my perspective, dealing first with the issue of corruption, lack of accountability, the failing of the justice system, the impunity has to be at the top. Not just putting drug traffickers in jail, important, I'm not saying it's not, but the priority, the number one thing really has to be at that level of institutional reform, greater transparency, greater accountability, or all the else becomes secondary. And we spend a lot of money, we do a lot of things, but it doesn't add up. So that's my 2 cents. I'm happy to invite Paco and Paloma's response in any way, but we also want a question from the audience. So any comments, or how do you want to handle it?
Well, let's go to the questions,
Okay.
and we'll work in
Yeah,
a
all right,
specific
all right,
response.
All right. So we have a question over here. Please do speak into the mic because while we may hear you, people online watching on the webcast may not. So.
Hello, my name is Miriam Hassan. I'm an international consultant with the Inter-American Development Bank, and I specialize on migration. And I'm interested in Matthew's presentation. A lot has been said about violence in relation to unaccompanied minors. So would it be possible to do the maps that you do, putting also with major sending areas, if they correlate with the areas where there is the highest levels of violence, and if there is a way to target, what policies would be good to prevent migration in those areas if there is a correlation with that? And I mean, it's very interesting. The analysis that you are doing, I think, is great. It allows to see more in detail the policy.
You can take one or two more, and then we'll. There's one behind you there, Christine. In the back. Oh, Christina. Hold on. We'll get this one, and then we'll get Christina, and then we'll take some answers. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. My name is Roberto Bando, originally from the Dominican Republic, but also very interested in Central America in general. And while I believe that prevention is a key component of any citizen security and public safety initiative, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on your thoughts on the prison system, because of the really high rate of recidivism throughout the region. So while we could be successful at preventing crime to happening and targeting at-risk youth, if we have thousands and thousands of people in Central America in prison who go to prison at early ages, and they don't spend their whole life in prison, they go out in the community in 3-4 years, commit crimes, come back, it's a merry-go-round. So if you could talk a little bit about your thoughts on that, that would be great.
Great. Christina, and then we'll take some answers, and I know there are more questions, so we'll get to them.
Thank you.
Please talk into the microphone.
Yeah, I just wanted to take on the issue of place-based and the locality, because I think it's really important, and I would encourage the U.S. decision makers to go even deeper and abandon the municipality level and go to the canton. And that's a pretty challenging because there are no figures of crime at this level. You have other things in the Ministry of the Economy, but of what I've seen, the basic unit is the canton, and there you see the clusters, because you can have it in the same municipality 3 cantones that are really very dangerous and 2 that are okay, and they cluster with other cantones of other municipalities. That's all.
Great, thank you. We'll get some more questions in a minute, but go ahead. Matt, you want to start? A couple of questions were directed to you, and then...
Is that on?
Yeah, everything's on.
Yeah, I'll take them in order. With regards to the first question, was it medium or? First, thank you very much. And I think the answer to the question really depends on the data. In principle, yes, you could do what you described, right, in terms of mapping migration flows, sending communities, but it all depends on the data. I would love to have the kinds of lower level disaggregated, highly disaggregated data that Christina is talking about. Ideally, I'd love to have the address of each individual occurrence, right? That would be beautiful. I mean, aesthetically and analytically, I think it would make for really pretty maps, if nothing else. But practically, realistically, that's not available. I haven't seen the canton level data. In Mexico, there's data at the state, the municipality, and then what the INEGI calls locality, no? Localidades. That's a much finer picture of what's happening that you can get in Mexico, but I haven't seen that elsewhere. Even in Brazil, great data collection infrastructure with the IBGE, they don't have that kind of disaggregated data. So I would love to see this, in terms of a data collection, data gathering challenge, something going below the municipality across the region, or if nothing else, starting in one country in Central America would be fantastic. But the short answer to your question is yes, it just depends on the data. And I think I spoke to Christina's question. I was really interested by Roberto Bandos. Am I getting your name correct? Your question about prisons. I think what's happening in prisons across the region, and let's be honest, what's happening in the United States with our prison population, but what's happening with the prison population across Latin America is appalling. Starting with preventive detention, the conditions within prisons, and it's one of the great sort of untouched, with a few exceptions, it's one of the great untouched research topics. I mean, Daniel Brinks at UT Austin really spoke very emphatically about this with regards only to Brazil, but what's happening with the Brazilian prison conditions, or the increasing population of prisons in Brazil, really undermines so many other advances in terms of the consolidation of the quality of democracy in Brazil. Just an appallingly high level or high rate of incarceration in Brazil. You could say the same thing about Central America and Mexico, and that's not even touching the conditions within prison. Right, so I think it's a great untouched research subject.
Paloma?
Sure. On the mapping question, USAID has done some mapping of our own internally, trying to understand where unaccompanied minors were coming from in the greatest numbers. And we were able to do that. We have a geospatial geomapping team at USAID. And so we know where they're coming from in the greatest numbers, and then overlaying our own programming. So we've said that we try to work in the toughest communities, and or if it's in Guatemala, for example, in the poorest rural communities, and and to understand, are we doing the right programs in the right places? And our initial mapping showed that, yes, sometimes they absolutely synced up. We were in the right communities, and other times we just weren't. And we don't necessarily know why. It could have been when the programs were designed. But we have been using those maps to try to help us understand what we're currently doing, and do we need to shift what we're doing? Are we doing the right kinds of programs in the right places? So I'd say that tool has been helpful for us. On the levels of crime and violence, as Matthew notes, there's not great data at the, we're able to map where communities are to a street level. So we know exactly which street they're on, they're next to the church, et cetera, et cetera. But there's not crime and violence level data, robberies, murders, that we can overlay necessarily. We have homicide rates very generally. But we have been using that technology. On the prison system, I agree, it's appalling. Our hope is by moving into this people-focused approach where we are now not only going to have programs that all at-risk youth in a community can have access to, but really identifying young people, and especially young people who've been in conflict with the law, that we will be hitting some young people who hopefully this will keep them out of returning to prison or returning to conflict with the law. We're not necessarily going to be able to target people and say, we're going to get this person out of jail and we can't do any of that. However, if they have been in conflict with the law and they're looking for a way out, we will be looking to work with them in various ways so that we can give them some alternatives to lives of crime and going back into that vicious circle of going back into really unbearable prison situations.
Yeah, just quickly on prisons, there's no question that is a very vexing policy challenge moving forward, both for foreign assistance and for the governments in the region on how they're going to address this. It is a ongoing source of just horrible humanitarian treatment within the prisons, the lack of any rehabilitative component to the prison systems, and the inevitable result of just high levels of recidivism. It is a real challenge, and definitely something people are talking about. What's been said about the correlation between homicides and the programs is key. I think we also, though, need to be very careful and look to additional research to also look at the overlay and correlation, using some regression models as well. The finding about extreme poverty, maybe not producing a conventional kind of outcome, but then the role of education and employment are also issues that we should be very carefully looking at. One of the messages I hope people will take away from today's discussion is that, yes, security is a critical challenge in Central America, but what we need is a more balanced approach to the region and how international partners and all of us are thinking about solving these problems. And we have to look at the governance issue. Impunity, corruption undermines so many of the things we try to do, but also, we've got to be investing in economic growth. Lack of investment in economic growth will leave very, very few alternatives for this youth demographic bulge that is coming at us, and that we've just begun to see over the last 3 or 4 years in migration patterns.
Just on the issue of prisons too, because I've been feeling like we need to do more work on that. UNDP estimated that overcrowding in Salvador was over 300% capacity. So it's an amazingly bad humanitarian situation. There's just no question about it. But I'd say prisons not only are bad in terms of conditions, but have actually become an element of the criminal enterprise. People are operating, we saw this in Guatemala recently, people in prison are operating criminal networks. So, it's not a matter of let's just give them more benefits, which they need, in terms of humanitarian things, but they're actually operating out of prisons. And so that's why it's an amazingly urgent thing, the humanitarian side and fighting crime in the prisons. There were some more questions here. I don't want to take up. There's one here. I guess that's Margaret. I apologize. I'm having glare there and a contact that's malfunctioning, so bear with me.
Thank you.
Margaret.
Margaret Hayes, the Security Studies Program at Georgetown. Matt, it would be interesting if you could give us a finer definition of how you measured education and whether, is this level of years completed? Are there geographic dispersion issues associated?
Right next to you there, Christine, other side.
Thank you to all the presenters. My name is Sara Benavides, and I'm with Chemonics International. My question is going even deeper from the canton into the individual. I would love to get to know a little bit more about what you guys are thinking in terms of working with programs that address individuals, meaning one of my experiences is just actually being in Guatemala and asking point blank different people and getting the same answer of, do you believe in democracy? And the answer was yes. Do you think democracy can exist here? And they would be like, no, democracy is something that happens like in El Norte and not necessarily here. And so I'm just kind of want to hear more about your take on that individual and tying it into the level of education and what is happening. I know that there have been USAID programs, for example, in Africa where we had TV shows that were addressing the question of health education and HIV. And we've often talked at this side how, the role of that TV shows and telenovelas play so much into that culture and internal education and getting really into the house in a way that otherwise we can't. So we'd love to hear more on that side.
I think there were a couple of questions behind there, too. I'm not able to identify in the glare here. I think that's Steve McFarland, right?
Thank you. Steve McFarland, former U.S. Ambassador to Guatemala. And the question is, what are the policy implications for the research that we just saw in terms of both the relationship of education to homicide rates, as well as this phenomenon that looks like archipelagos of extreme violence? How could the U.S. support countries trying to more effectively address that? How could we do it perhaps differently than we have to date? Thank you.
Right there. One last one, and we'll.
Hi, Catherine Johnson, Guatemala Human Rights Commission. And I wanted to follow up on your comment, Eric, about the lack of discussion of drug trafficking and drug flows. My question is, we've seen this shift significantly within the rhetoric around these strategies, but I'm wondering if there are the same shifts in funding levels. If we're seeing within the State Department, or including the State Department and DoD funding, for example, a similar emphasis on prevention and other forms of security, and de-emphasis on drug trafficking.
Okay. Should we go the same route? What am I trying to say? Same order. Excuse me. Matt.
Thank you for the question on education. The measure is a composite measure of 4 different indicators. I had 4 different indicators for education, including literacy rates, years completed, percent of the population that had completed primary education, and the measure is an aggregate composite of all 4 measures. So that's what I used. You could redo the analysis with each individual measure, but I was trying to sort of capture sort of some overall unmeasured educational attainment. I would love to see individual data. I suppose that goes without saying. With regards to the archipelago question, the very last question, I think, or I guess the penultimate question, I think somebody else said this before, but I would favor subnational policies above national policies. It seems like a lot of our security policies or violence prevention policies, development policies writ large are national in scope. And I suppose some of that is by necessity, right? And sort of countries need to negotiate with countries, countries need to have diplomatic relationship with countries. It's not like sort of countries can have diplomatic relationships with subnational units. No? But I think to the extent, going back maybe to the conditions or the incentives that the previous panel were discussing, I would heavily favor policies that condition maybe funding assistance on developing these kinds of place-based, geography-sensitive, subnational policies.
I'd like to address the question on individuals and how we're working with them. Currently, we're piloting a tool out of Los Angeles called the YSET tool, which is a tool that that city has used very effectively to identify the young people most at risk of moving into lives of crime and diagnosing the range of risk factors that they may be facing, whether it's abuse in the home, whether it's alcoholism in the home, whether it's drug use. They figure out a range of risk factors that can tell you which young people are likely to move in a certain direction, and then targeting assistance not just to that young person, but working closely with their family, figuring out how to improve the family dynamics, how to work closely with the family to support that specific young person. So instead of having a center that all the kids show up and you teach them something lovely, you figure out which 2 kids out of the group of 50 are really most at risk of moving into these lives and who will ultimately be victims of crime and violence or ultimately purveying crime and violence, and really target your assistance not only on them but on their family. So that's a sort of individual work that we're looking at, and we're piloting that currently, and that's one of the tools we intend to use as we move out of the what we call the sort of primary level prevention into more focused and targeted individual attention. And then on the issue of subnational versus national policies, as you say, it's as a donor, we have to work with the authorities we can. And we've worked quite effectively at the national level. I just want to give one example that Paco just reminded me in Honduras, where the current president a couple of years ago instituted a security tax and said the intention was to use the funds that collected from that tax to support a range of security initiatives. And he promised to us that he would funds that he collected would go towards prevention. And he very quickly, upon taking office, presented us with a large check of, I don't know what he committed, $1 million for to be invested in our outreach centers, which are these community centers basically that we help set up in hotspot and tough neighborhoods where young people have a place to go, to be safe, to study, to train, whatever it is. And we took that as a really serious sign of their commitment. So apart from having a national prevention policy, he acted on that and put money on the table. So I just wanted to mention that piece.
Yeah, just quickly on the policy implications and the comment about democracy. Secretary Kerry delivered a very definitive and authoritative speech yesterday at the State Department to the Western Hemisphere Diplomatic Corps that I refer all of you to on the critical element that democracy plays in the region and in development and in addressing these issues we've been talking about today. So I direct all of you to that speech as well. On the issue of aid flows, again, we do not believe that we can achieve the desired end state with the current level of resources we have in the region, or even with a short-term surge of U.S. assistance and other international assistance and private sector contribution. This has to be a sustained effort. But more importantly, it isn't about shifting resources from security to these other elements. It's about investing more and making sure that investment is done in a smarter, more balanced way where we are engaged in economic growth and economic development activities, and that where we're working on governance issues, like fighting corruption, like improving the delivery of social services and economic and educational opportunity across a much broader sector of the societies, and finally, really fighting to ensure a more equitable and broad-based fairness in the judicial systems that really ends the culture of impunity. I've been in the region, in and out of the region since the late 1980s. And one of the things, Eric, you said at the beginning that really struck me was, that we have been working in the region on justice sector reform for a long time. And yeah, there are ongoing problems. But when I look at a place like Honduras, where more than a decade ago, we were able to introduce, through some sustained U.S. policy engagement and AID programs, we introduced a more transparent, equitable judicial selection process, but then quickly political forces, maneuvered around it. And so it just underscores the need that even when we make these investments, we all have to remain engaged, and we have to ensure that civil society actors in these countries are being empowered to hold governments accountable. And that will be a significant element of some of the work and conditionality that will go into a renewed U.S. effort, assistance effort in Central America over what I hope will be the next 5 to 7 years at a very sustained level.
Just on that last issue, Paco, I agree with you, and I actually believe that the U.S. has supported civil society, Honduras in particular. They've done a good job through the CSO program. However, I do also, and this is just a very personal observation, have this strong feeling that the engagement with civil society around these issues of security and the strategies and all that is pretty limited when it comes to the countries themselves. It's very intimidating if you're a Honduran to go into the Honduran embassy and meet with somebody about what the strategy is. We did workshops on this report in all 3 countries with very well-informed people, and almost none of them even knew what CARSI was, much less what its priorities were. People say, well, we've heard of it. And this isn't just, your average person off the street. These are people, foreign ministers of cabinet, former judges, nobody knows what it is. So I'm with you. I agree. We've done good things to support civil society. We have to be a little more inviting, bring civil society in, because they're the ones that can hold their government accountable. And if we're just depending on government to inform civil society about these things, it's just not happening. And so I would encourage all the embassies, all the teams to have that dialogue with civil society and be proactive about it. Because I actually believe that if you called them up and said, we want to meet, they'd probably all say, sure. But it's an intimidating and difficult process, and you got to go out of your way to engage in that level of dialogue with civil society.
And I think one of the things, and again, I don't want to speak for INL, but having served in INL, I know the Bureau well. I know some of the things that have gone into the CARSI program. When you talk about some of these model police precincts that they've launched in Guatemala, that's CARSI. When you talk about some of the anti-gang activities and at-risk youth prevention activities they've worked with USAID on, that has been CARSI as well. I agree, though. It's very clear that there is a perception that there is a CARSI program out there, but it's not linked very well into people's lives in a way that they understand it. And as we move forward, we're going to have to continue work in the security sector. It's clear that it's needed, but we're going to have to do a much better job of tying all this together in this strategic approach, and then making sure people understand the investments that we're making really are part of that effort.
I'm sorry that our time has run out. Did you want to say a last thing, Paloma? I guess I need to give you
quickly
that
wanted to
chance.
jump in on the civil society piece, and just to say I agree that on branding, yes, that's been an issue, because if you ask, for example, Juan Orlando if he likes CARSI, not so much. Do you like these specific programs? Yes, he loves all of them. So we have an issue of branding even at the highest levels. And in terms of engaging civil society, AID's work, because we're so focused on young people in the security space, we regularly convene them, speak to them about their experiences. Across Central America, there's now the Central America Youth Movement Against Violence that we help them create, we catalyze that effort, and so it's happening. But on branding, yes, we never said this was CARSI supporting you.
Go ahead, sir.
Just one last point. I really can't thank the other panelists and Matt enough for this kind of research and how it will help inform us moving forward. Because it's very clear in an era of constrained U.S. foreign assistance resources, we need to be smarter about where and how we use those resources. And the kind of research that you all have done is really going to be helpful to us moving forward. And certainly, we need to do a better job of evaluating and monitoring the impact of how our programs are rolling out and where they're having success and where we need to do better.
Thanks. Thank you all for participating. Let me just give a real quick shout out to not only our authors and researchers who were tremendous throughout this process, but Peter, for your role here, not just here today, but for what you do at CRS. It's really valuable. I know all of our people read your reports and Claire's reports, and that's been invaluable. Obviously, Paco and Paloma for taking time to come over and join us. That's wonderful. Stephen Dudley, a good friend and really a wise man. I won't call him old, but a wise man. A special couple shout-outs, please. This was a year-long study to produce that book, and I couldn't have done it without a couple people in the background. Christine Zano, program associate, really helped us through the final month and a half pushing this through. So we actually had books here today. I really am amazed that we did that. And so thank you, Christine, for both your overseeing this project and contributing to the writing and the research. Catherine Moffett, who I'm hoping is watching us online, who was just, an intern, but really helped organize this project in the first 9 months. And Catherine, we miss you, and thank you for your role. And then other interns, Alejandra Guetta, who's here and been helping this morning, and other research, and our good friend and colleague, Veronica Colon Rosales, who's also been vital to this whole process. Thank you all for your attention. I hope we've whet your appetite. I hope you can take a look at these papers. They're all publicly available online. We want to get the discussion going. So thank you all very much.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely. Hey, Peter? Yeah. I need your card, Peter.
So,
I have some in my briefcase, but they're in